Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants Hangout. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I will be your host for today. It's been a pretty exciting February so far. We are featuring amazing women in science, adventure, exploration, and conservation. We've had a great batch of hangouts so far with many more to come. And I'm very excited today. This is day 2 of our Let's Talk Energy Week in partnership with Engenium and the Canadian Science and Technology Museum. Very excited to be joined by Tara Bernat today. She's worked for a number of nonprofit environmental organizations before she entered the oil and gas industry. Now she's a professional biologist at Encana. She works with teams of geologists, engineers, construction workers to plan where to place pipelines, roads, and well sites to have the least environmental impact. So Tara, it's so great to have you joining us today.
Great, thank you for having me. I'm pretty excited.
All right, and where are you joining us from today, Tara?
Calgary, Alberta.
Calgary, Alberta. So pretty cool, professional biologist.
I'm pretty excited to be able to do what I love to do every day, which is great. I grew up in a small town in Dauphin, Manitoba, and never thought that I'd be able to do what I love every day, so it's great.
All right, and I think that's a great little piece of advice to start off with is you've really got to think about, even now as a student, what you love and what you want to do, because a job can be forever sometimes. So
yeah, for sure.
You want to love your job.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I know you have a little presentation prepared for us to show us a little bit about what you do in the nature and the energy sector. So we're excited. We're ready.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I want to talk to everybody today about how a biologist like me helps to guide oil and gas development for the company I work for, Encana. So I guess just to kind of start off, I wanted to get everybody thinking about some of the different uses of oil and gas, just in your heads. I bet you everybody thought that about how, it's needed to make cars drive, planes fly, but maybe a little bit less thought of is that, it's used to make all the food we eat and even the clothes we wear, even all the cell phones everybody has, it's used to make all the different parts of that. But before we can use it for any of those things, we need to get it out of the ground. And that's really that's what Encana does. That's what the company I work for does. So, but they need people like me, who is a biologist, to help them plan where they're going to put their projects in order to get that oil and gas out of the ground. And that's really what I want to talk to you guys about today. So I have, like I said, I have a bunch of pictures here. Let me try to see if this is going to work. Joe, can you see?
Yep, the PowerPoint just loaded and it just went, oh, you just have to switch the screens for us.
Okay.
There we go. We got
awesome. You. Okay. So companies like Encana, oil and gas producers, in order to get that oil and gas out of the ground, we need to build things that we call developments or projects. So some of those projects you're probably pretty familiar with. So here's a picture of a well site. So a well site is needed to as spots where we drill into the ground to get the oil and gas. We also need to build things like roads, so roads to get to those well sites, and then pipelines. So pipelines actually take the oil and gas from the well site to places that change it into the things that we use every day, those products that we use every day that we were already talking about earlier. So one of the biggest challenges that oil and gas companies face is figuring out where to put all this stuff on the landscape. So the government in Canada and each of the provincial governments has a lot of rules on oil and gas companies about just that. And they're there to protect both the public and the environment. And I'm, of course, going to be talking about some of those environmental rules today. There's a lot of environmental rules, but I'm going to focus on the ones that I work with every day, so around wildlife and habitat. So just kind of thinking in our heads right now about what could be some of those rules put on oil and gas companies about wildlife and habitat. And I'll kind of give you a hint. It involves 2 categories. So one is the where, so where we can put these developments on the landscape in order to have the least impact on wildlife and habitat. And then the second category is the when. So when is the best time to build these developments in order to, again, to have the least impact on the environment? So throughout the presentation, I'm going to keep talking about the where and the when, and I'm going to go through some examples of both right now. So some of the where things on the landscape, like things that we want to look out for when we're building these developments, are features like wetlands. So here's a picture of a wetland. Wetlands are very important features on the landscape. They provide great wildlife habitat, and as well, the more wetlands there are, the less impact that things like floods have on our communities. There's a lot of other really good things that wetlands do for us, and as a result, they're protected in most places in Canada. So those are something that when we're building oil and gas developments, we have to look out for on the landscape. Other things like watercourses. So watercourses are flowing water. So these are things like rivers, streams, creeks, and like this picture of a river in BC, in British Columbia. So there are rules that we have to follow if we're going to be crossing these watercourses, or if we're even going to be working near them. We have to stay back a certain distance. And those rules are there to protect both the watercourse and the fish that might be living in them. Other things to look out for, wildlife, like this funny looking deer. It's giving us a funny look here. But not only wildlife, the places that wildlife call home. So like this den site that can be used by a bear maybe, or a wolf. Stick nests. So you can see this bald eagle sitting on that nest there. Those are obviously used for the bald eagle to lay their eggs and to raise their chicks. And nests come in many different forms. So this is called a cavity nest. It's built by woodpeckers, but it can be used by lots of other species after it's there. So for example, a mammal like a fisher actually used this exact tree to have their young inside. I don't know how he squeezed into that hole there, but he did. And then other nests, like smaller nests, like this robin nest. So there's lots of things on the landscape that when we're trying to figure out where to put these projects that we have to look out for. And then there's the when that I mentioned. So let's get into the when a little bit. So there are times of the year when different wildlife species are more sensitive to activities on the landscape. So I'll go through some examples. Up top there, at the very top of the picture, you can see a bunch of trumpeter swans. So the most sensitive time for trumpeter swans in Alberta and BC, where we work, starts in usually April and goes all the way to September. And that's their most sensitive time of the year because that's when they're coming back from their long winter migration. And they're trying to figure out if they're going to put a nest on a certain lake or a watercourse. Then they go and build a nest, they lay eggs, and they're raising those chicks, which are called cygnets. So that's the most sensitive time of the year for them. Other species, though, like this caribou that I have pictured there, their most sensitive time of year starts earlier on than the trumpeter swan. So that starts in actually February, because that's when the female caribou actually go off and try to find a quiet place to have their young. Other species like this toad that I have here, this boreal toad, its sensitive time of the year is usually May to about August, because that's when it's laying its eggs. And the eggs are laid in water, so the eggs get really sensitive to changes in water levels. So those are things that we want to watch out for if we have toads in the area where we're developing. And then finally, ducks, these golden eyes at the bottom of the picture here, they're considered what's called migratory birds. So they're birds that migrate, and their most sensitive time of the year is actually called the migratory bird breeding season. And that runs in Canada, in this area. It runs from about May 1st to the end of July or early August, depending on where you are in Canada. So if we're working in areas where these species are, we want to try to avoid disturbing them when at their most sensitive times of the year. So you can kind of start to see, it's kind of like a big puzzle. Like there's so many things on the landscape we have to watch out for, and then different times of the year that we also have to be mindful of. And there's a lot of other things too that I'm not talking about, like things like where the best oil and gas is under the ground. We obviously have to pay attention to that, being an oil and gas company, and also maybe where the best places are to build a well site, or how to build the best well site. So how do you think companies like Encana go about figuring this all out, figuring out this puzzle? Well, we have teams of people, and the people that work here really are the ones that really help figure out this puzzle for us. So we have people like geologists. Geologists find and they know where the best oil and gas is under the ground. And then we have construction experts that know what the best way to build a well site or a pipeline is to make it as safe as possible. And then we have soil experts that kind of, they help the construction teams to manage soil the way they can. And then, of course, there's me that talks about the wildlife and habitat portion of it. But we really have to put all these things together. So we have the people, but we also have information from the government that tells us about the landscape. So they have information that says, that there might be water here, or there might be a sensitive wildlife species here. And we also have things called guidelines. So guidelines are basically, they're created based on scientific research. So there's other types of biologists that actually go out into the field and they watch wildlife. And so for example, they'll say, they'll study a caribou and they'll determine how close we can get to that caribou before we actually disturb it. So we have that information as well. So what Encana wants to do is combine the where, the information source from the government, with the when, with those guidelines, and add in the people that work here. So we can try to figure out that puzzle of where's the best time and place to put our developments. So at Encana, we do this by having what's called planning sessions. So here's a picture of a planning session. So basically what we do here is all of those teams of experts that I talked about get into a room and we plan out where we're going to put our developments on these big movie theater type screens. I've tried to ask them if I can watch a movie on there because I think that'd be pretty cool, but they've never let me yet. So I'm going to keep trying. But so basically these sessions, we have lots of different people in them. So we have the geologists that are pictured here. A couple of the ladies pictured in this are the geologists. And like I said, they know where the best oil and gas is. It usually starts with them. And then we talk about all the different things that we have to watch out for when we're choosing where to put things. Like, for example, landowners that have fields and houses out there, and different cities and different protected areas. So as a biologist, my responsibility in these meetings is to talk to them about the sensitive areas that might be there for wildlife, to talk about those times of the year that might be best to build the developments. So what I'll do now is show you some pictures of some of the images that we look at on these screens during these planning sessions. So the first thing we usually start with is an air photo. So an air photo is a picture of the land taken from a plane. And you can pick out lots of different things from these air photos. So for example, here's a road. There's some farmers' fields there. Here's a river winding down on the right side of the screen. Some things are really, really obvious to pick out, like these dark spots, those are lakes. But some things are a little harder to see, like this is a wetland, for example. We have other information, like this is called LiDAR. This is a LiDAR image, and this is actually a picture of the land taken from a satellite in space. And what it shows us is the topography of the landscape. So it shows us where there might be really steep areas like next to this river, or where there might be nice flat areas that would be really good to build a well site. And it can show us these images so well because what it does is it just shows us the shape of the land. It takes away all the trees, all the colors and everything, and it just shows us what the land shape is. So it's pretty cool. So here's some information that we get from the government that I mentioned. So as you can see now, all the potential water, the places where water might be is shown, and this is data we have from the government. We also have information that shows where there might be sensitive areas on the land. So these colors show where there's a protected park, so a recreation area that we want to try to avoid when we're building our projects, and other areas like an old growth forest area that if we're going to be working near there, we have to follow very specific rules in order to protect that old growth forest. Other information, like this is a whole bunch of wildlife information now I'm showing you. So as you can see, those lakes that I pointed out earlier on the left, they're now outlined in pink. And the reason for that is that tells us that there are trumpeter swans that have used those lakes in the past. So the swans that I was talking about earlier, they actually use those lakes to build their nest in. So we have rules now on us that says, you know, if we're going to be working during that time of the year, we have to stay back up to 800 meters from those lakes. Depending on which province you're in, it's 800 meters in Alberta and it's 500 in BC now. So that's an example of one of the rules that we'd have to follow and that this information helps us with when we're planning our developments. So after we've looked at all of this information and we've talked a bit about it, the next step is to get on the ground and actually see what's on the ground where we're planning to put our development, because you really can't see everything from the air photo, and I'll show you an example of that. So along the bottom here, there's an air photo, and the brown line at the bottom shows where there's a road, and the black box shows where we're planning on putting a well site. So would any of you have guessed that along the side of that road there, it actually looks like that? Like there's so much shrubs and grass and green, like you wouldn't have been able to guess that just from that picture alone. So that's why it's so important for us to do those on the ground assessments. So basically after we're done that, we've done all the planning, we've done our on the ground assessments, you know, it comes time to build the developments after we get our approvals and everything like that. So, but even when we go, even though we've done all this planning, we still have to really look out and watch on the ground when we actually go to build a well site or a pipeline. And I think you guys can maybe think of why that might be based on what I already talked about. But I have an example, and I'll give you a hint. This area can be really good for a sensitive owl species that actually nests on the ground and doesn't need trees to build its nest in. So there's a hint, and I'll give you a really good story of why we have to keep our eyes open when we go to build. So last summer, we were going to build this well site here. It's the black square, and the construction team was out walking in the field and getting ready to construct. And then they came across a surprise, and it was a nest. So there's a nest on the ground. So at Encana, one of the things we do is we give wildlife awareness training to the construction teams. So that helps them to know what things they should be looking out for when they're out there ready to construct, and what to do in situations like this if they do come across a wildlife feature. So they did, they knew what to do. They basically stopped what they were doing and they left the nest alone, which is really important to do if you do come across an active nest, is to stay away from it so you don't disturb whatever built the nest and whatever laid those eggs. And then the construction team called us, the environment team. And turns out this nest belonged to a couple of short-eared owls. So here's a picture. So the short-eared owl is an owl that can actually lay its nest on the ground. It doesn't need a tree. And they're also a species of special concern in Canada. That basically means that their population levels are going down. So we want to really make sure we're protecting these species. So what we did in this scenario is we told the project teams at Encana that we had to delay our construction until these owls were done raising their chicks, which are called owlets, and until they were big enough to be able to fly away on their own. So we delayed our construction, and we also called, we knew there were some other oil and gas companies in the area, so we called and let them know that there's a nest here so that they can stop their activities in order to try not to disturb these owls. And finally, we let the landowner know, and the landowner actually ended up, he didn't seed his field until after these owlets were raised as well, which was really, really great. So we were able to set up a wildlife camera to enable us to monitor the nest and keep an eye on it without disturbing the owls. So a wildlife camera basically takes pictures on its own once in a while without having to have someone there. So because of that camera, we got some really cool pictures of these owls. So you can see the mama owl there. She's feeding her owlets and she's sitting on them, keeping them warm. And they were really good parents, you can see. They took care of them all summer. We did end up delaying construction of our well site for almost 3 months, just to wait until these owls were big enough. So here's a picture, one of the last pictures we have of them on the right. There's a couple of the owlets there. And you can see they're getting pretty big, and they're learning how to fly. These owls definitely became celebrities at Encana. We felt pretty good to be able to help these owls, raise their owlets without disturbing them. So it felt really good. And that's kind of all I have. There's my last picture of the little owl asking if you guys have any questions. And now I'm going to try to get back to you.
All right, Tara, that was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. You did such a good job of really laying everything out, how it is a big puzzle and then how the pieces come together. And that story with the owls was the perfect way just to put everything into perspective. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right. Well, I think it's about time we meet some of our classrooms because I'm sure they'll have some questions. But first, I can see we have viewers live on YouTube. So if there are any classrooms who are watching live on YouTube, your teacher can use the YouTube chat sidebar. So if you minimize the screen, it's on the right, and you can tell us where you're from and send us in a question or two, and we'll definitely get them in. And then I also want to give a quick shout out. A few classrooms had to back out today with weather issues, so hopefully they'll be able to catch the recording tomorrow, but we'll give a quick shout out to Mrs. Larmer's grade 1s and 2s in Corbeil, Mr. Van Roy's grade 3, 4s in Belleville, and then Mrs. Lex class was to join us as well today. So hopefully everyone's back in school tomorrow. But now let's meet one of our live classrooms. So first, let's go to Mrs. Elliott's class. They're joining us in Dallas in Texas, and they're a grade 7 class. How are we doing today, grade 7s?
Hi, my name's Eduardo, and I was wondering how technology affected the process of creating pipelines and transporting oil and gas.
Yeah, so we're using technology to help a number of different things around building pipelines. So technology helps us to make sure they're as safe as possible. So we're always putting in more technology to make sure that they're safe. So when they're transporting our oil and gas, to make sure they don't leak, we have things called that are monitoring systems that allow us to monitor if there would be anything like that. And just to make them better and safer, and make sure whenever we're putting them in the ground that they're as safe as possible and they have the least impact on the environment. Thanks for your question.
All right, and since we will have lots of good time for questions today, we'll go back to Ms. Elliott's class and see if you guys have another one. We'll let you go back to back.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I was wondering who or what tells you to be a biologist.
Sorry, I missed it. Can you say that again?
Oh, who or what tells you to be a biologist?
What would help me to be a biologist?
I think so. I think she's wondering who or what helped you become a biologist.
So I think that growing up where I did in a small town, and then we actually lived outside of the small town. So my parents always pushed us to be outside. We weren't really allowed to come inside much, to be honest, to play video games or anything like that. So I spent a lot of time outside just learning about the land when I was growing up. And we had lots of different animals as pets and things like that. So I learned to have a respect for wildlife, and I got really passionate about it. And then the other thing that helped me was a lot of my teachers. So biology was hard. I'm not going to lie. You know, it was a hard course for me. I did pretty good at it in high school, but university I found it really tough. And I think just remembering in my goal of what I wanted to do is I really wanted to work at a job that let me work with wildlife all the time. And so it made me, study a lot harder. It made me remember to keep that goal in mind. So I was able to make it through university, which wasn't easy, but I think I'm very happy that I did that now, because now I get to come to work every day, and I love what I do. So definitely my parents, my teachers, and just keeping focused on the goal and working hard.
All right, great questions. We'll see if we have time to visit one more time, but we're going to meet another classroom now. Let's go to Mrs. Mason's class. So your microphone is on, and Mrs. Mason's class is joining us. They're grade 4, 5s, and 6s, and they're joining us in Ottawa, Ontario. So how are we doing today, Mrs. Mason's class?
Thank you. Olivia has a question. Go ahead, Olivia.
How is your work related? What is your opinion on global warming, and how is your work related?
Yeah, so global warming is something that I think every company that produces energy has to pay attention to. So the way that we're trying to minimize our impact on that, or minimize our contribution to that, is by constantly putting in new technology to reduce our air emissions. I think that's a big thing. This isn't my specialty at Encana, but I can definitely talk to it a little bit. So basically, one of the cool facts that I learned recently is that in the United States, as our production of gas increased over the years, we were actually able to decrease our air emissions. So that's pretty cool, and that's all because of technology. So just like that first question we had, implementing that technology and always trying to get better with that is how I think we're trying to help with that global warming issue. So I think it's really all about responsible energy development, and that's something that we try to get better at all the time. So thanks for your question.
All right, that was a great question, and we'll see if they have another one for us.
Yeah, one more, probably a couple more, but.
How exactly does oil affect land wildlife?
Yeah, so I think the biggest way that it could impact it is when oil and gas companies are putting, like, we need to, like I mentioned in my presentation, we need to put those things on the ground in order to get the oil and gas from underneath the ground. So I think that's the biggest risk to wildlife, is where we're putting that stuff. So that's what I was talking about in my presentation, how important it is to pay attention to the where we're putting that stuff on the ground, trying to avoid the sensitive areas that wildlife need to survive. So they need those lakes, like those trumpeter swans. They need those lakes to be able to build their nests and have their young and continue on living in Canada or wherever they live. And then the time of year, again, like, we want to make sure we're minimizing our disturbance at the times of the year when they're trying to lay their eggs and raise their chicks and things like that. So I think that's the biggest risk, and that's why companies like Encana hire me, I guess, to make sure that there's someone there looking out for all that stuff. So we're trying to minimize our impact on wildlife.
All right. And then just kind of on your point there, it's really great to hear about companies that do hire people in your profession, biologists, and to see some of those stories, because we do often see companies painted in a negative light, but it is good to see that that's not the case all the time, and that there's all kinds of great stories, I'm sure, like those owls out there if you look around.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, we're going to jump to Mrs. Jones' class now. They are a group of grade 5, 6s in Chatham, Ontario. So how are we doing today, grade 5, 6s?
Good.
All right.
Great questions so far.
Excellent. Well, we're excited to take a couple from your class.
You can ask the one you wanted to ask, and then whenever you're ready to. You had a question?
How do you guys get the power all the way to the wilderness camera? And are you finding it harder to find oil and gas with all the sensitive areas you need to avoid?
Yeah, so the first question, how do we get the power? That's a really good question. So this camera is actually powered on batteries. So we actually don't need like a plug-in or anything like that, which was good. So that helped us put it out there and just get to leave it alone for a long time to watch the owls. And then your second question was, I think, or do we find it hard to find places for the project?
Are you finding it harder to find oil and gas with all the sensitive areas you need to avoid?
Yeah, it isn't an easy task, that's for sure. It takes a lot of planning, and I think that's the biggest thing is the longer period of time that we plan, the easier it is to find spots that are good for oil and gas and aren't going to impact wildlife very much. But it's not easy. You know, some areas are almost completely covered in things that we have to look out for. But the good thing is that different wildlife species, like I mentioned, have different times of the year. So for example, if we're in an area where there's a lot of birds, we have that season, the migratory bird season, that we have to be careful. But as long as there's no caribou there, generally winter is a pretty good time to build things, because we're not disturbing anything in the summer that are laying nests and breeding. If we're in an area where there's caribou, however, we have to watch earlier. So we have to, sometimes our sensitive time of the year can go all the way from February, when the caribou start, all the way till August, when once the birds are done. So those areas are really hard. But basically with planning and there's a lot of guidance out there that the government gives us to enable us to find those spots that are going to be good for us and good for the environment, or as good as possible. Yeah.
All right. Great group of questions. Is there someone else in Mrs. Jones' class who'd like to ask another one?
Yes, one more question. Do you know the maximum amount of eggs that those owls can have? And we're going to side of Canada to spread awareness on the positive action you are taking.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I don't think I heard much of it.
My first question was, do you know the maximum amount of eggs that those owls can have? And then my second question is, do you work outside of Canada to spread awareness on the positive action you are taking?
Yeah, so I don't know the maximum, but I know that this specific owl laid 8 eggs. So I think they can lay up to 10 eggs. So there was a lot of eggs in that little nest. So they lay a lot. Most of the time, not all of those eggs make it to owlets for a number of reasons. You know, there's predators out there, or maybe the egg just doesn't hatch on time. But in this scenario, we counted 4 baby owlets that were able to come from that nest of 8. So that was pretty cool. And around the spreading awareness, I don't think that that's something that the oil and gas industry has necessarily been great at spreading the word at some of the stuff that we do. I think that, and I know that's why I was so excited for this opportunity to be able to start telling that story that, as Joe mentioned, you know, often oil and gas companies get painted with a pretty bad brush sometimes, but I thought it was important to let people know that there are people like me working at oil and gas companies that really do try to help, and I know Encana is really trying to develop this resource as responsibly as possible. So I think we need to get better at spreading the word for sure.
All right, thank you for the questions, Chatham, Ontario. Let's take a quick visit in our classrooms again. And so Mrs. Elliott's class, we'll start with your group. Do you guys have another question for Tara?
We're so sorry, but we have to go to our next class, so we just wanted to say
thanks for joining.
All right, thanks for hanging out with us today, guys. Have a good day. All right, well, let's jump to Mrs. Mason's class and see if they have another question for us.
Two, but we don't know if it's possible. Come up, Rahul.
Oh, if there's 2, absolutely. Go ahead. We have a few minutes.
Having the pipelines above ground and having the pipelines below ground.
Sorry, say that again?
What are the benefits of having the pipelines above ground instead of having the pipelines below ground?
Yeah, so there are pros and cons of both. Generally at Encana, we have small enough pipelines that we are able to put them underground. And the good things about that is that once they're in the ground, they're kind of hidden. So they're hidden from the wildlife, for example. The reason why some companies have to put them above ground is because of their size. They can get pretty big, but it's not something that's really in my expertise around that. But definitely the benefits of putting them underground is again, once you put them in, they're hidden, and the wildlife don't even know they're there most of the time. So yeah.
All right, then putting them, I can see someone else coming up, but just quickly on that point, does that make it a little harder to maintain them when they're underground?
Yeah, there are certain things that we have to do, like keep the vegetation clear on a portion of them so that we can constantly go in and make sure we're testing them and make sure they're continually safe. So it does make it a little harder, but we have a lot of, again, we're so lucky that we have the technology we have these days. We have monitoring systems that enable us to monitor those pipelines, even though they are out of underground, out of sight. So technology is pretty great for our industry.
Okay, and I think I saw someone in Mrs. Mason's class. There she is.
Sorry, I missed that.
What happens to companies when they break the rules? The environmental rules.
Did you hear that, Joe?
Yeah, she's wondering what happens to companies when they break the rules.
Oh, so yeah, so there's so where we work at Encana, there's we work in Alberta and British Columbia. So both of those provinces actually have regulators. So there's the Alberta Energy Regulator in Alberta, and then the Oil and Gas Commission in BC. So they're the ones that they have a lot of those rules that I was telling you about, and they work with the government to create those rules and policies and things like that. So if we break the rules, basically the regulators can do a number of things, and those are all laid out in what's called acts and regulations. So they say what the regulator can do. So there's things like fines, like companies can be fined by not following these rules. There's even up to, jail time for some people. And these rules, I think it's important to remember that they don't just apply to oil and gas companies, they also apply to the public. So removing nests, for example, in bird season, that actually could result in a fine for even the average person. So yeah, you might have to pay money if you break the rules, and even up to jail time. We also can be suspended, so we wouldn't be allowed to construct anymore in a certain area, for example. That's another thing that can happen. So it's definitely one of the reasons why we want to make sure we're following the rules.
All right, and let's swing into Mrs. Jones' class one more time just to see if they have another question for us.
I wanted to know if you guys are working outside and you see like an animal get sick or something, do you bring it to a vet, or do you have like your own person that will help it?
So what we would do in that scenario is we definitely leave it to the experts. So for wildlife, there's people at the government that we can call, and they're fish and wildlife officers, and they can come out and determine what's the best thing to do. And generally for wildlife, it would be, there are wildlife rehabilitation societies that are basically like a vet for wildlife. So I used to actually volunteer at one here in Alberta. So these places are places that take in sick wildlife, and it's like a hospital for them. So they keep them there until they're better, and then they release them back into the wild. So it's pretty cool. But it would be those organizations that we would contact for sure in that situation.
All right. Well, boys and girls, your questions have been tremendous so far. We do have another minute or two. If there is any last minute questions, we can squeeze maybe another question or two in. No pressure, but I can see a hand in Mrs. Mason's class. So let's go there.
Where is the biggest oil producer in Canada?
Ooh, I don't know if I know the company. What company? I'm not sure actually. I know I don't think it's Encana, but that I don't know. I'll have to Google that later.
And then what about maybe a region in Canada where it's maybe really known for its energy production?
For sure. I think probably the biggest concentration of oil and gas right now is in northeast British Columbia and northwest Alberta. It's called the Montney development. So that's just the rocks under the ground. They're called the Montney. So that's the biggest, one of the biggest focuses of oil and gas development right now. And I know Encana, it works there a lot right now. Mm-hmm.
All right, to Mrs. Jones' class, one more time, just in case.
Yeah, we just wanted to say thank you very much.
Thank
you.
You're welcome. Thanks, meeting you all.
All right. Well, Tara, thank you so much. That was great. I think you had a great presentation and easy to follow and lots of really good information, and really exciting to see that there are careers for biologists in a lot of other industries maybe that students haven't even thought of before. So that's great too.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was great.
All right. Well, our two classrooms, you guys have a big job today. I'm going to turn your microphones on, and if you can say goodbye and thank you nice and loud, then we'll sign off for today. So let's get those microphones on.
Thank you.
All right. Well, once again, Tara, thank you so much, boys and girls. That was great. And then our next Let's Talk Energy hangout is going to be today at 2 o'clock with Norma Panetta, and she'll be talking about wind energy today, so you don't want to miss it. So again, thanks everybody, and we're signing off.
Thanks.